Welcome to Average Joe Rock and Roll. I am Michael J. Rock, and I am on today with Jason. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing well. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good, thanks. Doing really good. Liking the talking with people on the virtual couch. So welcome to the couch. Um,
Glad to be here. Thank you.
what's exciting you these days about music?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, being a child of the 80s and 90s and growing up on a hard rock and metal of that era, it's interesting to see how many bands have stuck together over time, how many bands have only one original member left, and how many music, albums that were recorded in that era still stand the test of time. They've held up over time. Some not so much, some do, but it's just interesting to see which musicians keep going and which ones kind of say, nah, like Vito Bratta from White Lion, he,
Yeah,
he bowed out once they got kicked off the major label. He just decided that's it for me. So a lot of new bands out there. I think there's some fresh blood, which is always exciting to see. Um, some of the upcoming hard rock bands. Not all of my love, but there's bands like Georgia Thunderbolts and even bands like the Struts. I think are keeping rock and roll alive and keeping it interesting, at least for me.
absolutely. Yeah, one band that I think of, when you talk about newer bands that maybe have some staying power is the Rival Sons. Don't know
Yeah,
if you had a chance to check out their latest album yet. It's really good.
I
I, you know,
I
I
haven't. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely worth a listen. It really grew on me. It to me, before that, the Great Western Valkyrie was my favorite. This now
hmm
is going to be my favorite. I think. It's really growing on me. I've listened to it now probably 10 times. Um,
wow.
and it's funny too that you talk about the progression of bands over the years, because a lot of these bands that don't have any original members or have like one original member, you know,
Yeah,
in a lot of instances, it's not because of people getting fired. It's, people wear out, people get older, they move
yeah.
on, they're not in music anymore. I saw a post one time, there was a Warrant song, one of the newer Warrant songs on YouTube, and somebody posted on there and they're like, yeah, he's no Janie Lane. Well, no, and somebody underneath said, well, Janie's dead, so a lot of people, didn't get thrown out of a band. Through fruition, they had to leave a band. So, and if you want to keep that band going, you gotta find that filler player, you know,
Right.
and, so if you go to a concert and you know that they're not originals, you can't complain about that because you bought the ticket and you went, you
Yeah, I mean, do your
know,
research too,
right, absolutely.
Don't expect to see a band that formed 30 plus years ago to have the same four or five guys.
Right,
At this point, that's just a ludicrous expectation.
right,
So
right.
do your homework. We live in the age of information. Google, the internet, it's all there at the tip of your finger. So if you really want to see what you're getting into when you buy that ticket or before you buy that ticket, check it out. See what other people are saying too. Some bands have to get a new singer, like, in Skid Row's case, they just could not get along. Sebastian and a few of the other members just, I don't see that bridge ever mending.
Right.
So, hey, I know they've gone through a couple of singers in the past 15 years, but I've heard great things about Eric. He was in that band Heat
Yeah.
for a number of years, Swedish band. I guess you would call them melodic rock or AOR metal or whatever.
Yeah.
It's kind of a melodic sounding 80s sounding hard rock, and he's a really good singer. So you know if you kind of open your mind a little bit and realize that, hey, I'm not going to go see the same four or five guys, but it still might be a really good show. They still may have that original fire and that original concept of the band. Then it may be worth checking out. Give them a chance.
I actually saw them live with Eric Gromwell,
Yeah,
and he it brings a certain energy to the band that probably hasn't been there since Sebastian left. Because Sebastian, like him or hate him, the reality is he was a stage presence and he had a ton of energy and he tried to
hmm
crowd. And Eric Gromwell's doing the exact same thing, and he's younger. He's at this point in time in his life, because he's younger. He also battled leukemia, so he's got a certain energy that somebody might not have because of his age, because of his battles. And the reality is he's a killer singer, and he nailed all those songs. He's not Sebastian, but you know what? Came pretty close. Another
Yeah.
person I think of is Jack Russell with Great White, right? So Jack Russell's never getting back with Great White. That's, you know, I mean, that ship has sailed.
Yeah.
We actually saw Great White recently with the newest lead singer. The kid's like 22 years old. And you know what? All of these other lead singers in Great White, to me, none of them sounded like Jack Russell. None of them even held a candle or came close. But this kid that they have,
Right.
he is very close, and he may have some staying power
Wow.
in that band. And I actually watched him talking to a fan, and the kid is very humbled. He's young. He doesn't have an ego. So he may have some staying power with that band.
Nice. Yeah, I know I haven't been attending concerts as frequently as you have. I know you're pretty active on the Monsters of Rock cruise and taking some bigger trips to shows. So I'm hoping in this year, and now that COVID's kind of behind us and a lot of that drama that went along with that, that I can start getting out and getting to, you know, more shows. And I've kind of done that this year, and I've seen Alice Cooper, I've been to the Eagles, Cheap Trick, a few other shows down here in North Carolina, Tennessee area. So I'm pretty jazzed to see what upcoming shows will be coming around in the next half year or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And every one of those bands that you mentioned have a bunch of replacement players, right? You know, you know, back
Yeah, every single one of them.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
Cheap Trick held it together for those four original guys for a long time. You know, they made it through the 90s and 2000s, and they just had a falling out with their drummer, Bunny Carlos. But, you know, they've got other family members kind of stepping in and playing second guitar role and filling in on drums, and they sound really good.
yeah.
It sounds like Cheap Trick. I know I wish Bunny could be there. But you know, sometimes the band as a whole needs to move on, and I'm glad they have, because you know that was a great concert to see in 2023. You know,
Sure.
I never thought when I first got into Cheap Trick back in the late 70s, early 80s that I'd be watching them 40 years later. You know, the band, I'm sure, you know, you hear musicians talking about that too. They don't think about, hey, let's start a band so we can be in our 70s and still play this music from this same band that we're starting right now. You just, you know, you don't know.
Right.
Of course, you know, the Stones have kind of set the standard for how long can a band go and stay together, you know, the core members of that band and keep it going. So they've set that high watermark, and you know, all the other bands from the 70s, 80s, 90s are kind of following that path. Some can pull it off and some can't. But yeah, Cheap Trick is one of those bands that can pull it off still in 2023.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned Bunny Carlos not being in the band anymore. I saw a recent interview with Steve Brown, Mick Brown's brother, who is now in Tesla. He's taken Troy Loretta's place on drums, and he was asked, you know, being in that rhythm section, he was asked what his approach were to the songs, and his answer was, "I'm playing them exactly as they were written. They're good songs. Why would I do anything to change that?" You know, so
Right.
you know, I think if somebody comes in a respectful manner, and not an ego, and he seems like a very down to earth guy, then you know things are probably going to progress pretty well, and fans aren't even going to notice. You know, in a lot of instances,
Most won't. Yeah.
right,
Drummers might notice, people that are, you know,
right,
and
yeah,
I'm sure, you know, he's got his own style. Even though he plays hard rock, and you know, he probably grew up on the same guys that Troy grew up on, being a child of the 60s and, you know, 50s and 60s. I'm sure they were into a lot of the same bands in the 1970s. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad that a lot of musicians kind of approach it that way. They don't try to create a completely different animal, or they don't take on a gig that doesn't fit. You know, when Cliff, the one thing I think of when I think of that is when Cliff Burton died in Metallica, and they were looking for replacement bass players. of course, you're never going to find another Cliff Burton. He was such an original, had such an original style, such a unique personality. How do you fill that void? It's for such a young band too. A lot of these bands are doing it 40 years on. Metallica had to do this 10 years into their career or so. What an undertaking.
Yeah, you can't. And God love that guy that comes in and tries to take his place, because it's not him. I mean, it's the same thing with Brad Gillis with Ozzy Osbourne, right? So,
Yeah.
Randy Rhoads dies, they got to do the Speak of the Devil tour. Ozzy needs a guitar player, and Brad Gillis is that guy, and he was under that shadow, and he did not want that.
Oh yeah.
He felt it.
No.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's huge shoes to fill. So like, Les Claypool of Primus, Primus from the 90s, more alternative and experimental. He auditioned for Metallica. He was a friend of Kirk Hammett, and he said, Primus hadn't formed yet. It was early on in his career. I'm not sure how young he was at the time, probably in his early 20s. But yeah, even back then, he was not a metal player. He could play metal music. He can play. He has the speed. He's got the dexterity. He's got the talent. But it was the wrong piece for that puzzle. And I think Les knew that going into it. That he just did it just as a challenge, and he was friends with Kirk. Kirk invited him out or whatever. So can you imagine if someone like Les Claypool came in to fill Cliff Burton's shoes, how radically that would change their sound? They didn't want that. They wanted to keep it Metallica. Of course, Jason Newsted got the gig from Flotsam and Jetsam, who he was playing with at the time, and he's got a different style. He plays with a pick, whereas Cliff was a finger picker. So there's definitely a different style there, but it fits. It changed their sound a little bit, but it wasn't radical.
Yeah. And he certainly felt that. I saw interviews with him over the years where, I think he felt like the redheaded stepchild of the band, just because of whose shoes he was in, for sure.
Well, yeah, and plus they hazed him. I mean, the stories of the hell that they put him through to initiate him into the band, and to kind of, they were grieving also. So I think it was just kind of a way to release those demons, if you will, and they took it out on Jason, unfortunately. But it seemed to have worked out pretty well. He didn't quit right away, so that's a pretty good sign. And he hung in there for a while.
Well, he probably had that type of personality where he could take it. A lot of guys wouldn't have put up with that.
Right.
Who cares? I don't care if you are Metallica. I'm done.
Right.
I mean, it takes a special personality to move through that. So, so you said you recently had seen the latest Alice Cooper show. How I know that they changed the stage set. How is it compared to previous concerts you've seen with Alice?
Let's see. I've seen Alice, I'd say in the past 10 years, probably 5 times. So kind of on an every other year pattern. With him. Last time I saw him was at the Casino here in Western North Carolina, in Cherokee. And that was about 2 years ago. That stage show was a little more elaborate. And I think the theatricals in that tour from 2021 were a bit more elaborate. Trying to think if Detroit Stories had come out yet at that point. I don't think it had. Maybe it was right before Detroit Stories came out, but yeah, it focused, he changes it up every tour. You're not going to get the same show. Yeah, a lot of the same songs. You're going to always hear Schools Out, and probably the very last song. I don't think he's changed that up for a while. There weren't a lot of surprise songs this time. Usually he pulls out a deep catalog nugget or two. Something like Clones from his 80s period, or even some songs from Raise Your Fist and Yell and Constrictor when they were on E Records in the mid 80s. Those are always welcome, because that's the era when I first started getting into him.
Me too. Yep.
I kind of got into Alice late. I don't have a bigger brother or sister to kind of turn me on to rock and roll. I was the big brother. So I was kind of discovering bands from friends, and mostly people my age. There were a few kids in the neighborhood that were a little older that turned me on to some 70s artists like Sweet and trying to think what else. Not so much Deep Purple, but anyway, there's other Thin Lizzy and even early Def Leppard when they first started out. I found out about them through a neighborhood friend who was about a year or two older than me. But yeah, and Alice Cooper, he still got it. I mean, the guy's, you know, in his 70s, right? Late 70s, I think, mid to late. He's
75.
up there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 75. That sounds right. His vocals aren't quite as strong, but they're not noticeably weak either.
Yeah.
You know, considering how old he is, I'm surprised at how good he sounds, honestly. So it was nice. I mean, I was actually kind of excited when Kane Roberts came back to the band because I grew up on Constrictor and Raise Your Fist and Yell. Those were the first two albums that I bought as new releases from Alice. I had Greatest Hits prior to that, you know, probably from one of those Columbia House Record Club or BMG Record Club deals where you get 10 albums for a penny or whatever. You probably remember those deals that used to
For sure.
circulate in the magazines and whatever in the local newspaper inserts. But so I had Greatest Hits and, you know, I liked it. But when he got back, when he cleaned up and he got back in the game and, you know, he came up with that video for from the not Freddy Krueger, but Jason, he's back, the man behind the mask. Yeah. From Jason 5 or whatever, whichever installment of that movie it was, or series it was. That's when I really got into Alice. So anytime he brings back a Constrictor song, or a song from, especially Raise Your Fist and Yell, because I thought that was the better of the two albums. It was a little more.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well written. It was better. It had better writing on it.
Heavier.
I think a little heavier, a little more coherent.
Yeah.
I think he was just getting his feet wet, you know, back in the water with Constrictor. But yeah, it was a great show. I highly recommend going to see Alice. And another band that I saw just last week that's been around for a while that I was pretty impressed with was King's X.
Yeah, Doug Pinnick, huh? Well into his 70s.
Yep, another guy who's, you know, when they were an late 80s, early 90s band when they hit their stride, you know, when they came on the scene, but he was a good 10 years older than the other guys in the band. They were a trio. Yeah. Still the same three guys. The drummer's had some health issues in recent years, a heart attack, and he's had some procedures done. But he's back in the saddle. He sounded good. Doug at 70 plus, you know, he's still really skinny Doug and still doesn't wear a shirt on stage and, you know, slings that bass, you know, really low when he plays. But he still sounds really good. Again, he doesn't sound like he's 30 or 40 or whatever it was when King's X were in their peak, but he's still very good. And they were very tight. It was a really good show. I'd recommend that tour as well.
He's one of the most underrated singer players out there. He did a project with the Winger band called The Mob, Red Beach, and you know, Kip Winger actually did the bass parts on that album. Doug Pinnick did the bass parts on that album. He just sang, and I don't know if you've heard that album, but I listened to the album and I think I can hear almost every one of those songs on there being sung by Kip Winger, but it's sung by Doug, you know?
Yeah.
And he pulls it off, you know? I mean, like, I'm thinking like, okay, so they don't sound the same, but if Kip Winger was to, you know, disband Winger, I would like to see that band proceed forward with Doug Pinnick in it. You know, I just think he brought a certain something to that band that Kip doesn't bring because they're two different vocalists. But it's a solid record from front to back.
Yep, very well written. The drummer from Night Ranger was on there as well, and he did he contribute any writing on that? I know he is a songwriter and a singer.
Yeah, I don't
when he's in Night Ranger.
I remember the actual album credits. I just know that I know Kip Winger wrote a lot of that. He produced it.
Yeah, it definitely has that sound. Yeah.
But
very recommended for Winger fans. I agree. It's a good album, and it came out and it didn't get much promotion, and it just kind of, you know, it was a one-off project.
Yeah.
It was just something to do to keep these guys busy because, you know, they just didn't have a lot to do, I'm sure. I mean, the demand, this was what, early 2000s probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, there just wasn't a whole lot for probably. There was just a project that filled time, and it was creative, and it was cool to work with other musicians. I'm sure they enjoyed working, collaborating with people that they normally wouldn't collaborate with. So, and that kind of kicked, and that's kind of been a theme for Frontiers Records really since then, where they kind of pick guys from different bands, and I think a lot of that the label initiates. But there's so many super group projects with George Lynch, and of course Michael Sweet with Sweet and Lynch, and Doug Pinnick was in several of those bands, and Night Ranger guys. The bass player and singer from Night Ranger, he was in several of these projects. So, and a lot of them are really good. I mean, some of them sound a little generic, but any of those stick out in your mind? Any of those projects? I love the first two Sweet and Lynch records. I haven't heard the new one yet, but
So, obviously always liked Lynch Mob.
yeah,
There was Lynch Pilson. That was
yep,
really good.
yep,
And
yep.
Pilson and Jeff Pilson did the lead vocal on that. I thought that was a really solid record. And we were talking about Reb Beach a little bit. He did another project called Black Swan with Robin McCauley on vocals. Did a couple albums
Yeah,
there.
very good. Yeah, that's a
Really
very
good
good
stuff.
band.
I mean, there, like you said, there's so much. I mean, Revolution Saints. Revolution Saints started as Jack Blades, Dean Castronovo, and
Hmm.
who was the guitar player? Was it?
Aldrich.
Yes. Yep. And I don't think any one of those members are original now. They've swapped them out already.
Yeah,
So
interesting. Yeah,
still a super group, just different members.
different members. Yeah,
Different
interchanging.
members. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And Dean
Um,
Castronovo is an interesting dude too, because he sounds just like Steve Perry when he sings.
yeah. Oh
So,
yeah,
they
he's got a great
replaced
voice.
Steve Perry with Arnel Pineda, and he does a great job. But they already had another Steve Perry in the band. Dean
Yeah,
could easily
pretty
take
much.
over. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure
he's
why he didn't, but he sound. I mean, I've heard him do Journey songs, and it's uncanny.
KXM was another project that I think Frontiers put out. Do you remember that? That had
Dude,
Doug
yeah,
Pinnick,
I was Doug Pinnick.
the
Yeah, yeah.
the drummer, at George Lynch on guitar, and I think the drummer from mm, the alternative band.
Oh, it was what's his name from Tool, right?
Wasn't Tool.
Or
No,
Korn.
it was Corn. Yep, the
Korn,
Corn
yeah.
guy.
Ray.
Ray Lucier.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And that project, it was okay. It was more alternative focused, not straight ahead melodic, rock or metal. But it was more kind of had a more of a 90s, 2000s metal feel to it, which is okay. I mean, but it didn't quite strike a chord with me as those other projects.
Yeah, when part of your rhythm sections from Korn, it's probably a little bit of a different turn. I did listen to it. I don't remember it.
Yeah.
How it sounded, which to me is not a good sign, because I
Yeah.
probably listened to it very much. But again, there's so much out there with the super groups, and there's only so many hours in a day, and
Right.
always want to go back to your staples, and what you really like, and the stuff that you just listen to over and over again, and the stuff that has the staying power.
Yeah. One question: why didn't King's X make it? Were you much of a fan of King's X
I
back in
wasn't.
the day?
I can
Mhm.
appreciate it more now than I did back then. I don't know what it was.
Yeah.
I had a friend that was big into King's X. He was a big King. His three favorite bands were King's X, Metallica, and Motorhead. Those were this
Hmm.
guy's favorite bands, right? And I just for whatever reason, I just did not get into them. But as I've
Yeah.
gotten older, and the more I've listened, the more I like, and I certainly am a Doug Pinnick fan. I really, like I said, I really like his vocal.
Yeah. I was working. I actually worked in the music business for a couple of years in New York City, and I was at Atlantic Records when King's X was on the label. This was early '90s, so we're talking what, '91. So I was at Metal Blade Records for a year and a half. So I was at Atlantic for about a year and a half. So we're talking 92, 93. King's X was about to put out their fourth album. And their third album, Faith, Hope, Love, was the one album that had such a huge buzz going for it. They had 2 albums under their belt. They started with Megaforce Records, which was the same label that had Anthrax and Metallica originally in the US. But you know, and then a lot of those bands transitioned. Ace Frehley was one of those as well. Transitioned over to Atlantic Records because they had signed a deal for like, hey, any bands on your label, we'd like to pull them up to Atlantic Records and give them a push. You know, put some major money into them because Megaforce can only afford so much. They're a small indie label. They've got a limited budget. You know, they don't have a lot behind them to push a band. Whereas Atlantic is obviously something, a label that's been around for years and years and has such a huge history and has a huge staff. So I was working at Atlantic Records when that fourth record came out, which was just called King's X. And this was kind of a telltale sign. That previous record, Faith, Hope, Love, there was such a huge push by the record industry to make sure that this was the album that was going to hit, that was going to make them superstars. People in the industry, fellow musicians, other labels, you know, people that worked in the industry in general, this was one of their favorite bands, and everyone so lucky to have these guys because they're going to be huge. That was kind of the general consensus in 93, 92 about King's X.
Yeah.
So Faith, Hope, Love is they made a video for It's Love, and I think they made one other video as well, and they put them on tours with major bands so they would get maximum exposure in these bigger arenas. But for whatever reason, and I thought that third record was a great record. Those first 4 King's X albums, in my mind, are the first 3 really are just classics. I know they're different. They're not, you know, this was late 80s, early 90s. They kind of had an alternative feel. The guitar tuning was a little weird for the time, really kind of ahead of its time, really, because, you know, they were kind of doing things that grunge bands were tapping into and later brought to the mainstream. But King's X was doing it first, at least, you know, for a major record label. And when that album, when that third record, Faith, Hope, Love, didn't sell, it got a lot of play. You know, it got a fairly good amount of airplay on alternative and metal shows and stations. I think MTV played the video, maybe medium rotation. I don't think it ever got into high rotation. So they gave it a shot, but I just, yeah, it's too bad because when that fourth album came out, I remember being in a meeting. I worked in the video production department at Atlantic Records, and they were going to do a video for a song called Lost in Germany, which was on that fourth album. And it was on the slate to be made. They were picking a producer for the video, you know, ideas for the video. I wasn't on the inside of these meetings, but I was kind of being informed because they knew I was a King's X fan. So sometimes they would come to me and say, "Oh, what do you think about this? What, you're a fan of Pantera and you're a fan of, you know, Skid Row. What do you think about doing this?" So once in a while they would do that, but yeah, at one point they were going to make this video. It was on the slate to be filmed or whatever, and then at some point they pulled it. They just said, "No, we're going to cut it from the budget." I don't know if it was a cyclical budget cut, but they decided, "No, we're not going to do this. We don't." And at that point, you knew that King's X were not a label priority.
Right.
When that third album didn't hit, and it was time to prep for that fourth album, if you didn't make a music video for a major record release in 1991, when MTV was huge, that was a sign that you were toast. You know, you were on your way out as far as that label was concerned, because they just saw you as a falling star rather than a rising star.
Sure.
And it was sad.
Yeah.
You know, it was sad because I really liked them. I thought they deserved it. I met them several times at various shows. And they were, you know, they're great guys, but it just didn't click with the general public.
Well, during that time period, and you know, the age of MTV, it costs, you know, in some instances in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a video. So, you know, they were probably being a little selective with that, and you know, they could have been pigeonholed a little bit too, because even though they sounded a little grungy, they weren't from Seattle, they weren't wearing flannel, you know, and they might not have quite fit that mold. So they might have been lumped into some of the other 80s bands that came out, like a Skid Row, that might have, if they were in the early 80s as opposed to the late 80s. So
You know what? I take that back. They did do a video for that album. I totally forgot that. They put it out there was a song on there called Black Flag. So that was the initial video. That song did not do well. It was the second video that they were going to do, Lost in Germany. And that's when they pulled the plug and said, this album's dead. It's not selling. This is their fourth record for us. The last one didn't hit when we put a lot of money into the last one. We don't think this one's as strong. So we're really not, and it's not reacting well to, that well with that first video. So when the second video time came around for doing Lost in Germany, they said, nah, we're going to pull the plug. They ended up releasing one more record, one more studio album after that. And it got zero promotion, no video for that fifth record. Anyway, it was, actually they did do a video for Dogman. It was the record after that. But anyway, it's just, after Faith, Hope, Love, that third record didn't hit. The writing was on the wall.
Yeah.
And their popularity did decline. I mean, their music kind of got a little heavier. The grunge era was right there knocking on the door. Their music started getting a little heavier, less melodic, less of the vocal harmonies, because that was kind of a highlight of those first three records, were those vocal harmonies. I think they had a falling out with their manager, which was the guy who managed ZZ Top. Name escapes me, but I want to say Bill Ham, but that's not him. That's another ZZ Top producer. But anyway, they're a great band. I'd recommend go see them. They've had a lot of ups and downs over the years, mostly downs, but they've got a hardcore following, and they do still go out and tour. So
yeah, no, well, I'm glad you got to see them. So unfortunately, Jason, we're about out of time here.
Okay.
Appreciate you coming on the virtual couch today. Appreciate
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll do it again at some point.
That'd be great.
With that, I am Michael J. Rock. I am a rock fan, enough said. Thank you, Jason.